For students in the room or anyone else who's curious, Canvas, which is our instructional technology system, is out right now. If you read the news, you'll hear about you'll hear that it's been hacked. So it might be a little while. What that means for turning in response papers, I don't know yet, but I wrote a version of the prompt on the board. If tomorrow Canvas is still out, I'll figure out a different way for you to turn in response papers. Okay, so look forward to an old-fashioned email from me. Okay. For everyone else, for folks who don't know me, my name's Kate Darby. I'm a professor of environmental studies here at Western. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. Okay, thank you everyone for being here. We're continuing our panels this week. I'm really excited about our panel entitled Challenging Assumptions About Gender, Sex, and Vulnerability. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists and then let them share a little bit about how they're thinking about this topic. So I'm going to start in the end with Dr. Tammy Lanninga is an associate professor, newly promoted actually to professor, congratulations, and program director for the Urban Planning and Sustainable Design program. Dr. Lanninga studies land use reform and how communities can adopt policies that will make them more resilient, affordable, and diverse. Then we have Dr. Ruth Sofield, who is a professor of environmental toxicology and chemistry in environmental science here at Western. Her research group focuses on the effects of emerging contaminants on aquatic life. She's a member of the Puget Sound Partnership Science Panel and a board member of the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. And then next to me is Dr. Rebecca Pachi Green, associate professor, though also newly promoted, now professor, and chair of environmental studies at Western Washington. She studies natural hazards and how communities can use environmental policy planning and education to reduce their disaster risk. So the prompt that I gave these folks to get started is to just tell us a little bit about how these ideas of gender and sex show up in their field and their work. So I'm going to let them each say a little bit about that, and then we'll dig in with some questions. I hope you all will have lots of questions as well. We didn't talk about who would go first. Do you want to start, Tammy? Okay.
All right, I will say that Kate and I did not plan our outfits this morning. All right, so as Kate mentioned, I am an urban planner and I teach in our urban planning program. If you think about cities and you think about your way of navigating around them, you can kind of quickly imagine who probably was behind some of those designs and the way that our environment was built. For the last however long we've been laying concrete and thinking about the ways that people move around cities where they live. It has been primarily designed by white, wealthy, able-bodied men. And I think if you don't necessarily fall into one of those categories, you probably have had experiences that you wonder, why is this built the way it is? Why is it so difficult for myself to get around, or other people that you might be caring for or living with, who are experiencing and living in the world differently than the people who have been planning for the built environment. The field historically has been male dominated. Today we are getting closer to maybe 40% of female identifying people working in the field of planning. We're getting there, but it's still not an equal point at all. And if you think about the people who are in charge, who are working in the 9,500 cities across the United States, maybe about 30% of women are in a leadership position in those areas. And if you're thinking about transportation, which is such a critical way for us to get around in our communities, only 15% of women are working in that particular subset of the urban planning field. We have really, if you think about housing and transportation, we've done a really good job of separating a lot of things that require us to use automobiles to get places, personal mobility, generally speaking, and that requires you to be wealthy, to be able to own a vehicle. Because our cities are sprawled and low density, we need to have access. We have poor public transportation because we don't have enough people to actually support those facilities very well. So those are the challenges that we see in our communities. And there are whole lots of other things, now that we have climate change, and whether cities are experiencing more drought or more water in lots of different ways, it continues to impact people who have already been feeling vulnerable in the urban environment. I would say what I really am, I feel positive about with regard to the field of urban planning is that we are starting to get it. And that we see a lot of changes that are happening in our communities. Something that reduces people's or increases people's ability to get around in a city is by having mixed use development where people can literally be able to combine trips and be able to easily go from a house to a commercial area for shopping or dropping people off at a school or getting other places. The more different types of uses you have near each other reduces the amount of interaction and time that people have to build into their day to get places. And I would say also, as a professional organization, the American Planning Association and the certified planners are recognizing that the negative impacts that our profession has had in communities through redlining and racialized zoning are being addressed through our code of ethics. And that we have really strong justifications now in our professional ethics that tell us that we need to be planning for communities in ways that will reduce and redress those impacts that have historically impacted communities of color, low-income communities in our cities. So we have a lot of really good support these days to help us think about ways to make our communities livable for all of the people who find themselves in a city. And I'll wrap up and pass it on to Ruth, but over 80% of us live in cities in the United States, and globally it's also increasing. And so it just is a great place for us to figure out how to make it work for everybody that lives in those places.
Hi. So my name is Ruth, and by training, I'm an aquatic toxicologist. So what that means is I study chemicals in the environment and how they impact organisms that are living in the environment. So my focus tends to be on things that live in water, so fish, invertebrates. I think about other aquatic organisms like marine mammals, so whales, for example. I also like to think about how my field relates to humans. So my expertise is really in how does a chemical get into the water and affect a fish that's living in the water, for example. But I also think about, but what does that mean for humans? And so I do kind of go back and forth between those types of thinkings, and they are different. So this was really fun for me to think about, this prompt that we had, which was about vulnerability, which is not a term that I use in my discipline. And and as we were talking about it, I said, but I'm having a hard time with this. I'm having a hard time thinking about this. And the term that I use is susceptibility. And so that is a fish. I'm just going to stick with fish for a little while. Is a fish susceptible to a chemical that it's exposed to? And so I want to kind of jump to a different way of thinking about susceptibility. And a lot of times susceptibility and vulnerability can be used interchangeably, but they really probably shouldn't. And there is a distinction that can be quite important. So as an example, there's something that we know about, which is called alcohol flush syndrome. So this is in humans. And alcohol flush syndrome is a genetic inability of some subpopulations of humans to fully metabolize alcohol. And because they can't fully metabolize alcohol, they end up with an intermediate chemical that they're producing in their bodies that is actually toxic and can lead to esophageal cancer. Okay. So, and we know that it's a variation of a gene, and we know that about 35% of East Asian populations have this variant. And so if you have that variation in your gene, you're more susceptible to getting this type of cancer if you drink alcohol. So that would be susceptibility. Vulnerability would be, it includes susceptibility, so you have this variation in the gene that means you don't do as good of a job of metabolizing alcohol. But if you're in a culture where alcohol is important, it's part of maybe a business culture, so you drink alcohol, you're now exposing yourself to more alcohol. And so this is a cultural aspect. So the drinking and the expectation that you drink as part of a cultural need to fit in or to be part of a business culture, to build a network, that now is how we would think about vulnerability. So you have both a susceptibility and a cultural, an extrinsic reason to expose yourself to this substance, alcohol, that increases your risk of cancer. So that's a way to think about these two terms. And so with aquatic toxicology, so now I'm going to go back to what I study in my lab. We know for a fact, we have a lot of good evidence and a lot of knowledge that we've had for a long time that biological sex impacts susceptibility to chemical exposures. We know that when we think about marine mammals, they have different processes that males don't. They have gestation, so they get pregnant. They produce offspring. They do lactation, so they produce milk. And we know that these processes are ways of taking some chemicals that are already in the marine mammal's body and removing them. So the milk is a way in which these chemicals get concentrated and moved out of the female's body. So we know there's biological processes that make a female more or less susceptible to chemical exposures. We also know there's differences in foraging behavior between male and female fish, where some male fish will go out into the open and look for food, which makes them more susceptible to prey or to being preyed upon, versus females, which like to stay closer to the shore and hide in vegetation. And that means they're going to come into contact more with sediment that would have different chemicals. So they're going to be exposed to different chemicals. If we think about humans, so I'll do one more example and then pass it to Rebecca. Actually, I want to do two more things. If we think about humans, if you think about women and their occupations, you might see more women working in a beauty parlor, for example. And those women are exposed to a whole suite of products and chemicals that somebody not working there would be exposed to. And we know that a lot of the toxicological studies around exposure to these chemicals are done for people who are exposed once occasionally, not every day. And so getting at this idea of vulnerability, their occupation creates a different way in which they're exposed to these chemicals and makes them more vulnerable than males would be. And then the use of beauty products. And if we have some time, I have this great little paragraph that I'd read. But women use beauty products more than men. And the chemicals that are in those beauty products can be toxic. And so that creates a difference in the vulnerability between males and females, or people who use the makeup or not. And so one thing, in 2015, the National Institute of Health, which is our nation's medical research agency, announced a commitment to improving health outcomes of both men and women, and acknowledged that sex and gender play a role in how health and disease processes differ across individuals. So it was this kind of formal acknowledgement that there's a difference in how biological males versus females, how susceptible they are to chemical exposures. And so they started to require that studies include both men and women, where historically that wasn't a requirement, and there was an over-reliance on male animals and cells. So we start with knowing biologically there's a difference between males and females and how we interact with the world, how we process chemicals, how susceptible we are to chemicals. And yet at this National Institute of Health level, there wasn't a requirement that females also be studied. And that has changed. And there is a big commitment, I would say, from the NIH now to that focus.
Hey everyone. So I use vulnerability almost every day, and all the students in my class use it all the time. This is a core concept. For ease and simplicity, I'm just going to say I am in the field of disaster studies. And in the field of disaster studies, we start with the assumption that disasters are not natural, that they are socially and historically created. And because they are social processes, people do not experience disasters equally. That disasters and the impacts of disasters target groups based on historical, economic, social, and marginalization processes. So when we look at disasters, we look at the hazard that may be a trigger event for a disaster. Think like flood, tsunami, earthquake, cyclone, landslide, drought, all of those hazards. But we then need to look at vulnerability and exposure, which is going to tie in quite a bit with what you have been saying. So we unpack this term of vulnerability quite extensively, but surprisingly, unpacking the concept of vulnerability along sex and gender is, I think, fairly recent. Like 1999 was sort of the seminal start, which that's not very long ago. And that early work initially really focused on an approach that was epidemiological. And it looked at the outcome of disasters and saw whether there was disproportionate impacts based on sex and gender. That early work focused mostly on mortality and a little bit on morbidity. I was part of a couple of studies in Nepal and in Turkey after earthquakes in both of those countries that was looking at like who died in those events, and were there differences across, in that case, sex. And what was found in both of those earthquake cases was that women tended to have a higher likelihood of death in those events, proportional to the population exposed. Women were much more likely to have died in those events. But to counter that, you can look at some other hazards. a really interesting one is heat waves. And there's been a really seminal study from 1995 for the Chicago heat wave. And that study found that men were more likely to die from heat waves. Then you can go to other hazards and look at what the gender and sex difference of mortality is and get some really interesting things going on. In flooding, and there's a lot of different hazards that cause flooding, so if we're in Southeast Asia or South Asia and we're looking at who dies in cyclones, most of the deaths from cyclones happen due to drowning and the flood impacts of cyclones, and it is overwhelmingly female deaths, just absolutely overwhelmingly. But if we come back here to North America and Central America, hurricanes and floods here tend to have higher levels of men dying in those events. And I'll unpack a little bit later why that's all happening, but that was like the first start of thinking about sex and gender in disasters, is just looking at who's dying. A second wave of thinking about vulnerability, sex and gender and vulnerability, happened in the last 15 years around the vulnerability turn in disasters, where researchers started looking at like what happens after an event. Okay, some people die, but a whole bunch of people survive. And then what happens in the response and recovery? And they have found, as you can probably imagine, that it is a highly gendered experience. That disaster response and recovery feels very, very different based on, in this case, generally your gender. Some of the things that wind up playing out relate to what Tammy was talking about a little bit. In the immediate aftermath of a disaster, when people are trying to just put their lives back together, women typically have sort of an excess burden that falls to them, often around their social roles of care. And they wind up often having to care for young children. They often have to care for elderly people and people who have been injured in that disaster with a whole lot less resources. Like suddenly there's no schools, but you got to care for all these kids. Suddenly, you got to feed everyone, and the grocery stores aren't functional anymore. You got to help everyone get health care for injuries, and those systems of care, those structured systems of care, hospitals and clinics, are in shambles. And so there's the social burden that women feel around their traditional roles winds up being quite heavy. They also wind up having a lot of emotional, they have to carry a lot of the emotions in their household and in their community around disasters. And there's a lot of emotions to be had. And so they wind up in this caretaking role that often undermines their ability to self-care. That said, other things are happening for men. Disasters for men are often quite traumatic to self-identity because two things sort of play out. In many cultures, men are raised and encultured to be see themselves as being valuable because they are physically strong and because they are emotionally stoic. And disasters can often cause injuries that make it difficult for them to be the physically strong person that they thought they were. And the emotional stoicism often is maladaptive in a post-disaster situation. Often so, it winds up coming out in a community in the form of increased aggression, often targeted at girls and women. So a lot of this is playing out, and it plays out in really interesting sort of time lapses. And I just want to give you one example, and then we'll start another round of questions. And that's coming from 2011. Japan had a very large earthquake and tsunami. I was there a year after and talking with survivors of that event, and especially how their lives had played out. And one thing that was really interesting is that in the immediate aftermath of the tsunami, many people were displaced and they didn't have anywhere to go and they had no housing. So the first sort of big thing the government had to do was provide mass shelter. And this mass shelter was kind of gymnasiums, big gymnasiums with a bunch of cots. And that experience was very hard for people who were girls, women, and transgendered people, because there was a lack of privacy, and there was no place to change. Women, rightfully so, wound up being very afraid to go to sleep. And there was gender-based violence occurring in those shelters. Fast forward a year later, and the recovery had shifted from everybody being in cots in these big gymnasiums, and the government had set up these little temporary housing villages, very tightly packed, like think kind of like tiny homes, except they're kind of made out of paper and plastic, and just very regimented. And because of the experience that had happened in the shelters, some of the communities in Japan sex segregated their temporary housing, and they had a section for families, a section for single women, a section for single men. This is immediately problematic for transgendered people, but it also became incredibly problematic for the single men. The rate of suicide went up remarkably, and that was gendered male. The men were much more isolated and had lost their connection to a wider community and were less capable of enduring that isolation.
Thank you. Lots to unpack there. I wanted to, because I think both Ruth and Rebecca kind of contextualize what vulnerability or susceptibility looks like in their fields. And Tammy, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything. Is vulnerability a concept that shows up in planning? Is it different from the way maybe Rebecca talked about it in disaster contexts? And you can say no if you'd like.
I think talking to them.
I have. I think probably a couple of the areas where, I think vulnerability in planning tends to occur. I wrote this down. I'm going to find what I said. So, okay. Vulnerability really comes about when you think about the location, the quality, and the density of development. And it's linked to social inequalities. It's linked to, it impacts disasters, certainly. And I think the areas, when we think about density, and I mentioned this a little bit before, but if you have really low density development and it's all one type of development, which is just housing, if you don't have a vehicle, how do you go shopping, or how do you get food for your family, or how do you get people to places if you don't have good public transportation and access to a grocery store or some other area? The quality of the housing, that has to do with like how quickly was it built, what are the materials, what type of environment is that house in? Is it all concrete and just retains heat in a really hot climate? Does it mold easily? Do you have single pane windows? Those kinds of things. And then again, just the location of it, like how far away, where is that housing located in comparison or proximity to jobs, other social networks, other places that you might be wanting to go or getting to. So that's how I would say, yeah.
I'm going to add something just because we're thinking about it together. And I had never thought about it, but only somebody who never had to run around and take kids to school and the hospital and the dentist and then go grocery shopping. Only somebody who never had to do that a bunch would come up with the idea of putting all the houses in one place.
Yeah.
Yes. Having just done that this morning. Yes. So the prompt that I gave you all had so many contested terms, right? I mean, vulnerability is kind of sticky, and then gender and sex, right? Contested, sticky sorts of terms. So I wondered if we could just spend a couple of minutes sort of, I would love to hear like how your field conceptualizes those. Does your field not even touch one? Like, and then bound up in that, are there assumptions, because we're talking about assumptions about a gender or sex binary that are sort of built into the field in which you operate? Do you see examples of where researchers are sort of looking beyond a gender binary and considering gender and sex in a more complicated or different way? That's a lot of questions. Take whichever part or none of them you'd like.
Okay. So sex really is, I would say the focus, biological sex is the focus of toxicology as a discipline, whether it's human toxicology or aquatic toxicology. That being said, there is maybe kind of an extension of the work with humans where we think about the vulnerability part is where gender can come into play. And so thinking about how somebody might be exposed to different chemicals is where gender comes in, and cultural norms and expectations play a role there. So that's what I would say. But I would say primarily focus on sex, like the biological determinant and how that relates to different processes in the organism and susceptibility. And you also said there was something else. I think there's a recognition that by not understanding how non-binary people interact with the world, that we're missing something. So there's a data gap there because of that. So I think there's that recognition. I would start there.
So I would say planning is very much gender focused, less on sex. This goes back 100 years or more, forever, but I was just thinking about this question and thinking about the Chicago Plan that Daniel Burnham wrote in 1910. And the focus for that plan was huge monumental buildings, giant parks along the waterfront, and focusing on commerce for businesses, shopping, retail, that kind of thing. And if you go to the city of Chicago, you will see giant monumental buildings and big, beautiful parks along the waterfront, and the shopping districts like right off the water there. And the women had such different requests for the Chicago plan. They asked, well, what about housing? Where are people going to live? And they're like, oh, the private sector will figure that one out. We don't have to worry about housing. What about public restrooms? Where are those going to fit in these big monumental parks? Oh, don't worry about it. Why do we have to think about that? Like, that's not a big issue. And what about playgrounds? What about parks in our neighborhoods? And these were all questions that they were bringing up. And they had nothing to say. They were like, we have the plan and we know what we're going to do. The other thing I think I would add to thinking about the gender piece, I mean, I've already brought this up a little bit about mobility and the fact that it's a term is called a trip chaining, where you're linking a whole bunch of things together. And yeah, our transportation systems aren't thinking about that. But also issues related to safety and public spaces, and how are we accommodating the needs of different people in these different spaces. And I think beyond, like, just to bring this to a little bit, I know we're talking about gender and sex, but the intersectionality, the other pieces I think that are really critical for the built environment have to do with age and disability and your socioeconomic status. And so I think that all of those things combined are really critical for people who are thinking about the ways that our cities are planned, because in terms of like how people are living in them and experiencing them.
And I'm Goldilocks, and I'm right in the middle, because in disaster studies, we need to be thinking about both. Certainly, when we're thinking about vulnerability, we are thinking about gender and gendered experiences and the multiplicity of genders that people have, both in our society and in other societies, and the ways that those play out and create vulnerability. So I told you that women died in earthquakes in Turkey and Nepal more than men did. And like, why is that? And if you unpack it, it's because in those societies, their gendered roles were to be in the household. And when the earthquake struck, most of the men were out in the fields, and most of the women were inside cooking, and the housing is very fragile and prone to collapse in earthquakes. And so they were exposed to the structural failures of the houses in the way the men were not. And then I said, like heat waves, the men were dying, specifically the older men. And unpacking that along gender lines, it was clear that women were more likely and were more socialized to check in on each other and to live in a way that meant that they saw other people. And the people who were dying in the heat wave were older men who were isolated and less aware of their own fragility and less willing, because of cultural norms around gender, to ask for help or think that they needed to go to a cooling center. And then the flooding all over the map. It's really, really hard. It's really hard to swim with a sari if you're in Southeast Asia. And it's really hard to swim with a sari if you are also trying to hold a kid on your hip. And if you're not getting the early warnings because you're at home and the early warning is occurring in the city center. And so the very, very high death rates for women in South and Southeast Asia are coming again from these gendered norms. And here in the United States, the deaths for men in flooding is also gendered. And the most vulnerable people in flood situations in the United States are your age group men, young men. And it's risk-taking behavior. Two forms of risk-taking behavior. Some rescue behavior, like going out and trying to rescue people and then putting themselves in danger. And also just sort of a sense of invincibility. And most of the deaths are happening with young men driving across flooded roads, thinking that their car, their truck is going to make it, and it doesn't. And they get swept away and they drown. The only death we had in Whatcom County in the 2021 floods was a man who was trying to get to work and drove through floodwaters. So gender becomes this incredibly important lens in thinking about how people are socialized and engaged in these disaster experiences. But then we can't totally abandon biological sex either, because there are a few very specific needs that people who are lactating, people who are menstruating, people who are giving birth have some very specific needs in shelter and response and recovery, and those have often been overlooked in ways that can directly harm women or the people who are experiencing those things. So we got to hold on to both of them.
Do we have any questions from the audience or from online, Ava? Yes.
Sometimes it's not common for women still to swim.
Yes.
Like even just like not knowing how to period because that's not a normal thing for you to learn based on gender and like sex work like that.
So I'm just going to repeat the question and I'll hand it to
Repeat it as I.
Thank you.
So the question is there a knowledge gap? And yes, and I would call what you're describing a skills gap. So if you are a young person in rural Bangladesh, and you're a girl, you are not getting the skills training to swim the way your brother is. And it very much plays out.
I was wondering, like, is there any work in looking at how hormone replacement therapy would affect biological reactions to toxins? I'm guessing there's not.
And now she has a new research.
So the question was if there's research into how hormone replacement therapy is impacting susceptibility to toxicants. I'm going to go with probably not. Like that's pretty specific. I mean, I'm going to maybe twist that question a little bit. There is a lot of study on how chemicals that are released in wastewater treatment effluent that start with a female body, so birth control pills, for example, and the HRTs would be part of this. When they get released, when we go to the bathroom, they go into a wastewater treatment facility that does not 100% remove those chemicals. And so then those get released into an aquatic environment. So then we have good evidence that we see things like changed ratio of male to female fish, for example, because of exposures to those hormone mimicking chemicals. We also see differences in fertility, differences in behavior related to reproduction in fish. So we do know that kind of thing happens.
each of you have almost the same topic based on how women are facing so much issue in our environment, like this nature, like how you said, Professor Green, that you said that how women facing so much disaster and they tend to die easier, during hurricane, earthquake, tsunami, and stuff like that. And Professor Sophie, how you mentioned how women body through alcoholic can be affected, like how their body system is easily to be like, like their cells like tend to die easily, or their kidney. Like, I'm just wondering why women being targeted, like why it's affecting women, like based on the different gender, like why because why men is like tend to be the one to have enough energy to survive all these environmental issues.
But Sanchez, I disagree with you. I think that, remember the example of men dying by suicide in Japan. Remember the men here dying because they are engaged in risk-taking behavior. Remember the men dying in heat waves because they are less likely to seek help. Gendering impacts everybody, and it puts a straitjacket on us all if we're not careful.
And I would add as another example, remember the male fish that are more aggressive in their feeding behavior. They're the ones that are more likely to be preyed upon. So I think for me, the kind of bottom line is that there is a biological difference between males and females. There's different hormones. There's different metabolism. There's there are differences that we know and we can track, and that changes how a chemical interacts with the body. And then you layer on top of that, there are different behaviors which change how likely that organism is to come into contact with the chemical. And so these are, it's complicated, and it's not just one thing or the other thing. There's a lot of things that go into this that we have to think about at some level.
So I want to say something. All right, so my remark is a little different. In that, I've been talking about how our built environment has primarily been built to, for a certain person. And so what the field of planning is doing now these days is getting better so I'll talk about public engagement and communicating with people who are using the built environment in ways that we haven't heard from those perspectives before. So just this is a very local example, but the city of Bellingham just recently updated their comprehensive plan, which is a guiding document that sets priorities and goals for the next 15 to 20 years into the future about how our city will grow. And a big emphasis in developing that plan was extensive public involvement and public engagement. And they also had an advisory group that they were able to pay, recognizing for the people that were in part of that advisory group that they needed to take time out of their day to spend time with these planners to provide their feedback based on their lived experience and based on who they were and represented in our community. That was very different than the people that normally are attending a planning meeting or showing up at city council or things like that. And so they went out of their way to say, if we want our community to reflect all of the different people in our community, we need to hear from them. And we also need to compensate them for their time to ensure that they understand that their time is valuable and that we can support their needs in that way. So, and that included childcare, and a whole bunch, food, and all sorts of things to make sure that those people, that this wider group of folks could provide really valuable input.
Yeah, and just building on that quickly, I think, just going back to the fact there has been in the past 10 years or so, a directive that both men and women have to be studied if National Institute of Health is going to fund the work. And so I think the thing is we know there's a difference. We've known that. And as I said, we know the reasons why there's differences in how susceptible a male versus a female would be. It's just we haven't always put the effort into studying it. And that's the part that is changing.
Which just depresses me because in disaster studies, including in the United States, the vast majority of countries, I think there's only 11 countries out of 100 and, 96, actually sex disaggregate their mortality and morbidity for disasters. Here in the United States, I can tell you how many people have died over a given time period for a certain hazard type, but I can't tell you if it's more men than women because we don't even bother to collect that data.
I hate to tell us that our time is up because that's an unfortunate note to land on, but I think I do appreciate that these last remarks really did, I think, pull out some of the challenges around making assumptions about gender and sex in our fields, but also about some of the work that's begun to happen in your fields to consider gender and sex more fully. Join me in thanking our panelists today. Thank you all for being here.